tonality of velvetyness. More. Jesus Christ. Crunchy. It's a lot like the chunky and punchy. Crunchy, chunky, punchy tones. B sets, you know, boo. That makes so much sense, right? Hey, so today we'll be talking about terminology, guitar tone terminology, and I'll be doing my best to try and explain it. So there's been discussions since the beginning of time about guitar terminology and stuff, you know, people talking about fat tones and chunky tones and, you know, gritty tones and this and that, and a lot of people claim that they are meaningless, and sometimes I think, am I the only person that, you know, some of this makes sense to? Like, call me crazy, but I think I know. And I'm no professional. Take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I'm definitely one of those people that sling some of those silly words out. So today we'll be talking about that. Of course, could I please ask that you go and subscribe if you haven't already? Most of the viewers are people that are not subscribed, so yeah, it helps this tiny little channel out a lot. So I'll be talking about like frequency peaks and like resonant peaks and stuff, you know, a little, or it can be like way broader, or it can be like a very sharp peak, you know. So I'll be using that terminology also, which maybe needs another video, but hopefully you all kind of are on the same page and understand what I'm saying. I have my notes here with me, so don't mind that. Okay, let's start off with a classic, chunky. I'm gonna kind of work punchy in with that too. Chunky and punchy. I believe they're very similar. So I think it kind of lies within the low mids from like 100 hertz to around 500 hertz. That section that has a low end, but it's not super low, but it's almost like the mids, and it creates this low chunk. And but part of it also is like some sort of EQ bump a little bit higher up, around like 1,000, which is kind of like right where a guitar tone kind of sits, and together it just creates this. I have to use these terminologies to explain it. It's totally bizarre. Maybe this is all just a big mistake. This is getting silly. But it creates a chunkiness to the tone. So I guess this is going to be about talking a lot about frequencies of these terms. Alright, so let's move on to, okay, another classic, crunchy. A crunchy tone. It's a lot like the chunky and punchy. Crunchy, chunky, punchy tones. Yeah, it's another one that's kind of hard to explain, as usual. But I'd say a crunchy tone has a gain structure. If you were to look at its wave form, wave file sort of thing, you know, if you look at any noise, it creates a wave. And there's sine waves, which are smoother like that. And then there's square waves, which are like very sharp. And I'd say a crunchy tone has a bit more of a square wave to it. Not totally though. Most fuzz pedals are like total square waves. That's why they're so like crunchy and fizzy, or not fizzy, but you know, staticky. Like the more square wave, the more staticky and like, you know, the more like that it is. And crunchy has a bit of that, you know. It's not like a nice, it's more, Jesus Christ. Yeah, so I think it has a bit more of that in it. And, you know, I think that's what kind of breakup is. It's just literally the waveform itself is a bit more broken up, and it just comes out, you know, kind of crunchy. You know, like a sine wave would be more like eating warm oatmeal, and a crunchy tone would be more like eating Captain Crunch. You know, you can even hear it in food. You can visualize it in waveform. This is all making tons of sense, right? So yeah, the crunchy tone is a bit more square wave than it is a smooth sine wave, and it's more broken up because of that, and just creates a grittier, more broken up sound. That breakup and whatever is kind of focused in the mids, a little bit lower down, but in the mids, around like 700 hertz to like 2000 hertz. The crunchiness is happening in there somewhere. Like I said, it's kind of like the chunky punchy thing, you know, it's just, it creates a chunkiness. There's a bit of chunkiness in there, but it's in the lower mids and mids. Which leads us to the next one, gritty or grit. It's like crunchy just before this, but it's kind of focused higher up in the frequency spectrum. You know, around like 1000 to 5000 hertz. And it's just the same thing, a bit more square wave-ish, and it just creates more like, it's like throwing pop rocks into your smoothie, you know? It's just more like, there's more artifacts, I guess you could say. Grittiness is one of my personal favorite terms and tones. I think a gritty tone also coincides with just like a raunchy tone. You know, it's just dirty, raunchy grittiness. They all kind of fit in there. And then crunchiness is kind of like gritty, raunchy, dirty, but just a little bit more subdued, a little bit more in the low end. It's a little smoother. So grittiness is like a more in-your-face crunchiness. Oh God. Okay. I hope you're all, you know, on board with this though. I love talking about all this type of stuff. I love frequencies and all that crap. And I mean, I've been dealing with it for like decades, literal decades, just since I've like been recording music and stuff like that. And again, not that I'm a professional or anything, but you just get used to this stuff and it becomes somewhat familiar. Smooth. A smooth tone. You know, liquidy and smooth. Typically, its EQ is like, rather than having sharp peaks at certain frequencies, it'd be rounder, like whoop, you know, kind of more softened out, rounded resonant peaks / frequency peaks, whatever you want to call it. And I'd say like a smooth tone definitely has some like lower end, so it just kind of like fills out this spot in the low end and creates a velvetyness. And I believe it resides somewhere around like 150 hertz range, just a bit, quite a rounded, broad peak. Sometimes even with a bit of a mid scoop, just to emphasize that like kind of fat or low end. And also I think it has to do with kind of a rounded high end also, maybe around like 5000 hertz, which is kind of where like a guitar's presence comes from. So yeah, and the high end would be kind of rounder also, so it's not so sharp and not so biting. Speaking of bite, I think the bite comes from like 3000, 5000 hertz range. It's kind of the brightness. Would have like sharper resonant peaks, EQ bumps. I think that's where the bite comes from. And I'd say most treble controls on amps, you consider that like a bite control, I would say. Okay, next up is fat tones. Kind of like smooth, but kind of deeper and stuff. So again, rounded EQ bump around 100 hertz. Even like lower, a bit lower and even a bit higher. So like anywhere from like 70 hertz to 150 hertz, I'd say. Also again, possible a bit of a mid scoop to emphasize just that fat low end. Because if it's just like, if the waveform is just fat there and then levels off in the mids, you know, up to 1000 or whatever, then it just sounds very like, this kind of where bold comes in, you know, it's just, there's a lot of frequencies there, a lot of content. But if it's mid-scooped a little bit more, then creates that, pushes that fatness forward, the low fatness. Whoa! Oh my god. Okay, anyway. Okay, next up is bold tones. And a lot of these terms, there's a lot of overlapping in them, of course, much like the frequencies that they use. So, bold. Similar to chunky, it kind of is not quite as low as the chunk. Bold is a little bit more towards the mids. I think the boldness of a tone resides around like 500 to 600 hertz, you know, maybe even up to 700, somewhere around there. It's like kind of the mids. Mids make a tone bold rather than just having a valley in the within the EQ form, you know, and having that like sizzling high end and the big low end, and then not much there. The boldness is in the mids. You know, it gives it some form, some structure, if you will. All right, sizzle. This is one of James Brown's favorite terms from Amp Tweaker, or you know, the old PV days, or now he's working with EVH. He loves sizzle, and I do too. I kind of think sizzle has a lot to do with like, it's basically the presence. It's like a presence control in a power amp or whatever, such as the 5150. So yeah, sizzle I think kind of sits in the pretty high range of frequencies, around like 7,000, 8,000 hertz, and it can be achieved with various EQ, whether that's like a high shelf, which just kind of raises all of the EQs from like, you know, a high shelf on 7K hertz would take 7K hertz and everything after that and just raise the whole thing, you know, rather than just like a bump. So yeah, a high shelf just raises everything like brrr. That makes a lot of sense, right? I'm sure like people just are gonna think I'm crazy and a total idiot, but whatever. So yeah, it can be like a high shelf or even just a rounded EQ, you know, on the EQ bump, resonant peak, whatever you want to call it, or even a sharp one. I think any of those can create sizzle in a tone around 7 or 8,000 hertz. It's where that like guitar tone is just has that sizzle, you know? It makes sense. All the shit makes sense. Y'all are crazy that think that tonality terms just are meaningless. Okay, so next up is muddy. Many of you may know that do recording stuff and have looked into it, that the mud typically resides around like 200 hertz to 400 hertz. I'd say it's usually quite a roundedness in that area, because just it brings in a lot of those frequencies over that whole range, and it just fills up too much space kind of in the low end and low mids, and creates this sluggishness to the tone. You know, around like 200 to 400, the frequency range, it would like be battling many other things, you know, whether it's toms and I mean even bass guitar and stuff. That frequency range just doesn't really favor a guitar tone. I mean, unless that's what you're going for, and that's totally valid also, if you're trying to do a weird kind of effect or something. But yeah, so it sits around 200 to 400 in a very kind of rounded, wide EQ bump. And even some, like in the sub-lows, I don't know if it's a sub-low technically, but that's what I call it, but around like 40 hertz to 80 hertz, you know, all the stuff that you would normally cut out, that definitely creates a lot of mud. It just gets in the way of like the more important frequencies. Okay, so now boomy or woofy, it's pretty similar to muddy, but I'd say it sits around like, it's too much of a rounded, too much content, too excessive in the 60 to 120 hertz range. And yeah, it's kind of just the same deal. It just creates too much in that area. There is some sort of like resonant peak around there, like 100, 120. You know, if there's just too much of it, too much going on there, then it just creates this. It's like, it's almost like where the letter B sits, you know, boo. That makes so much sense, right? Holy cow. I know. Go ahead, laugh. I'm funny. In a not a haha way. I get it. Anyway, so... Okay, next up is dark. A dark tone. You can probably guess it's just a lack of high end. Lack of presence to the tone. I'd say a lack of 3,000, 5,000 hertz. That's exactly just where kind of the guitar brightness sits, and even like the higher end, kind of where the presence sits, a lack of like 8,000 hertz, because you could still have a guitar tone that doesn't have excessive brightness around 3,000, 5,000, then you could still bump the presence up, and that would kind of create, you know, it would bring it out front a bit more. But without one of those, then you're gonna have a pretty dark tone. You know, it's just gonna kind of have that blanket over the speaker type sound. It's like hearing it from outside of a club or something like that. Okay, so next up is nasally or boxy tone. And that definitely resides right around the 400 hertz range, kind of lower down. And yeah, it's just exactly what it sounds like. It's really hard to try and explain these things, but like, you know, like what is boxy? What is a boxy tone? But it's around 400, and you know, all these frequencies change a bit depending on your amp and depending on everything. There's so many variables, but yeah, that's where nasally boxiness comes from, and it's gross. Unless you're doing like some kind of effect, as I said before. A lot of, especially with like, I don't know, modern metal songs, the very beginning of the song will have this like far away sounding kind of almost like a radio lo-fi kind of, you know, guitar riff going, then kind of boom, and then the song comes in. And a lot of time those tones are very boxy with no low end and not much high end. And it kind of creates a lo-fi radio sound. Okay, classic one, everyone's favorite, ice picky. You know, an ice picky harsh tone. Usually that, I would say, resides in the high mids and highs, around like 4,000 to 6,000 hertz. And I'd say it's just too much of that in general, or too sharp of a peak in one of those areas. I'd say it's almost always somewhere around like 45K, something like that. Somewhere around there, but you know, it can kind of vary. It can be a combination of frequencies around that area, but typically like 4,500 hertz. A lot of amp sims tend to have like, I don't know why, but they tend to have a bit too much of that. Like, I don't know what it is, but you know, a lot of people will say to make a bit of a cut there, and you can use like a sharp peak, and you like move it along the frequencies, and you find where it is, and you'll hear it, 'cause it'll almost create this like whistling, this high whistling tone, which makes you just, you know, cringe and wince, and it's horrible. Again, it can be high up too, just like a high scratchiness, around 6K. Yeah, it's not pleasant. It's kind of a weird thing too, because like a lot of your presence and brightness comes from that whole area, so you just have to be really careful, because some of those spots are very pleasant, and you need to have some of them. Typically you need to. And but some of them are like really harsh and gross. So it's kind of a weird thing that way. Okay, so next up is brittle. Again, similar to ice picky. I'd say it resides a little bit lower in the frequencies though. It's more like from 2,000 to like 4,000, somewhere in that area. It's almost similar to like the nasal boxy thing, but higher up. Yeah, it just pops these gross frequencies up, and for whatever reason, it just takes away from the like punch and like aggressiveness of a tone. I don't know. It's so hard to talk about this stuff. Gosh darn it. The last one, and one of my favorites over the years, thump. Thump. That like kick you in the chest, or punch you in the chest, punch you in the gut, some people say. The thump. Again, it's like chunky and punchy, but it's an emphasis on the lows. And I'd say it has a pretty like, it's kind of a combination of like a bit of a roundedness, low down in like this pretty low, you know, you're feeling like that like rumble almost. But like a more of a rounded EQ down in like the 60 to 100 to 150 hertz sort of thing. But there's some like sharp peaks also that like really stick out and create that like that really kind of that sharp attack. Probably around like the 150, but even it kind of has to do with like higher up mids also, like around 1,000. Yeah, it's similar to chunkiness. It's not just, it doesn't just reside in one little pocket of frequencies. It's kind of a combination of like really lows and then, you know, around 60 to 80 hertz or whatever, and then kind of like a sharper thing around 100 to 150, but then also like somewhere in the mids 1,000-ish or so, a bump there, and just together it creates a thump. And you can like, when you see bands play live, you can just feel it. I'd especially relate it to I don't know, like, well, most metal bands in general, but like I always I always relate it to like old school death metal bands like Dying Fetus and stuff like that. I think some like a bit of mid scooping can emphasize it even more. Yeah, so that's thumping as far as I'm concerned. Alright, so that wraps it up. I know there's so many more terms that we could go over, but I think those are some main ones. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about it all. You can make fun of me in the comments if you want, or agree, tell your side of it. Yeah, I love talking gear and frequencies and dorky stuff, so feel free, and I will do my best to answer everything. And again, if you liked it, then go subscribe, please. Alright? Okay.